Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. I'm lost in the stacks of the Edgar Allan Poe Reference Library in search of Poe's very first collection of short stories. And to answer the age-old question, was Edgar Allan Poe funny? We'll find out tonight in the Curator's Crypt. Well, today you're going to help me answer the age-old question. Was Edgar Allan Poe funny? Well, we're going to try looking at a couple of his short stories. And nowadays we take it for granted that it's pretty easy to find a collection of Poe's complete tales. Whether it's in your local library or bookstore or online, or at the Poe Museum's online store, you'll have no difficulty finding one of these short story collections. It wasn't quite that way back in Poe's day. In fact, it took him a lot of work to get his first book of short stories published. It was when he was 30 years old. He published his first book of poetry when he was 18. So by the time he published his first book of short stories, he'd already done 3 books of poetry, a novel, and a book about seashells. Nobody seemed to want to publish a book of his short stories. I mean, he'd been working at it for 7 years. He had this whole plan. He was going to publish a book called Tales of the Folio Club. It was going to be a collection of mostly humorous tales, and the framework would be that it's told by members of a club, and between the stories, they'd critique each other's stories. It was going to be sort of a satire on literary criticism of the day, which was probably going to be really funny to literary critics like Poe, but not so much to everybody else. So when Poe finally did get that book of short stories published, he had to throw out the whole Tales of the Folio idea and come up with something a little bit different. It's right here. It's called The Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. It's a 2-volume set, and these are first editions right here at the Poe Museum. Original cloth covers, and check that out. The original paper labels on the spines, all the way from back in 1839. And when we take a look on the inside, there's the title page, the dedication, there's the copyright notice. Back then you actually had to deposit a copy of your book to get it copyrighted. And it contains, we'll take a look at the table of contents. There's 25 of his short stories, pretty much every short story he'd written up until that time, but it's maybe not the ones you recognize. He hasn't written The Pit and the Pendulum, The Cask of Amontillado, The Telltale Heart, The Black Cat, any of those big name short stories yet. What you're going to see in here are Poe's early short stories, including some of the great terror tales he wrote in his 20s, like The Fall of the House of Usher, Ligeia, William Wilson, Morella, Berenice. And you really need to read them because this is Poe unfiltered. This is Poe at the very beginning of his career, whereas later in his career, you get some bodies buried behind walls or underneath the floorboards. In the early fiction, you get people getting their teeth ripped out. So lots of fun horror stories here. And those are the ones Poe calls his arabesque. They're more serious tales. They're tales of terror, but he wanted to let people know these weren't Gothic tales. There was a tradition going back to Horace Walpole with his book, The Castle of Otranto, extended on to Anne Radcliffe, Mary Shelley, Matthew Lewis, of these stories about haunted castles and family curses, an air of gloom and decay. But Poe wanted to let people know that he's doing something more than that. He called that stuff pseudo-horror. In fact, in the preface here, he wants to make sure everybody knows he's not writing Gothic stories, which at the time people were calling German tales. So right here he says, but the truth is that, with a single exception, there is no one of these stories in which the author should recognize the distinctive features of that species of pseudo-horror, which we are taught to call Germanic, for no better reason that some of the secondary names of German literature have become identified with its folly. If in many of my productions terror has been the thesis, I maintain that terror is not of Germany but of the soul, that I have deduced this terror only from its legitimate sources and urged it only to its legitimate results. So he wants to know, this is something new, this is something different than those old stories of haunted castles and ghosts and the supernatural. Here is Poe trying to move away from that to something more modern. Seemingly ordinary people who lose control sometimes and do extraordinarily horrible things. So those are the arabesque. What about the grotesque? Well, Poe defined these as his farcical tales. You probably don't recognize the names, but in volume 1 right here is King Pest. This is a story written just a few years after the 1832 cholera pandemic killed millions of people around the globe, and here's Poe writing a comedy about it. It's about 3 drunken sailors in plague time London who stumble upon a death party. People are just dying. One of them's already in his coffin. He has armholes punched out the side so he can still drink and be merry for the last remaining hours he has left. And they're all drinking out of human skulls. They have a skeleton hanging from the ceiling with a light in its skull to light the room. I guess Poe thought this was funny. But one author, Robert Louis Stevenson, who gave us Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, read this story and said, whoever wrote this has ceased to be human. This is in such horrible, awful taste. But here's another one of Poe's comedies. In volume 2, we have Loss of Breath. It's about a man who yells at his wife so much, he actually loses his breath. He can't find his breath. He's unable to breathe. Eventually, he goes everywhere searching for his breath. He goes into the city where, since he can't breathe, people think he's dead. Naturally, they rob him and just dump him out on the street, where a surgeon finds him. And the surgeon decides, hey, dead body, why don't I dissect it? So he takes it to his operating room, starts dissecting it, pulls out the organs. Even after he figures, this guy's probably still alive, he just keeps pulling out organs. And eventually a cat comes in the room and starts eating the man's nose. And that's what finally gets the guy to get up off the table. He jumps out a window where he lands in a cart that's carrying a man to the gallows, and they accidentally hang the guy from the gallows, thinking he's the other guy. Of course, he doesn't have any breath, he can't breathe, so hanging doesn't kill him. So then they place him in a tomb, and eventually he finds his breath. Somebody else has stolen his breath in the tomb, and he's able to get his breath back. You're going to have to read this one and let us know. Is this funny? Let us know down in the comments. We're still not quite sure. But take a look at some of these early Poe stories and let us know what you think. And I'll let you know what some of Poe's readers thought. Just like in a lot of today's books, there were blurbs in the front written by other authors who'd read the book. And right down here at top, we've got John Pendleton Kennedy, one of the most famous novels of the time. He's so popular that he's above the number 2 author, Washington Irving. Poe actually got some Washington Irving blurbs for his book, taken from some letters of his. It says, I am much pleased with a tale called House of Usher, and should think that a collection of tales equally well written could not fail being favorably received. Its graphic effect is powerful. So that's old Washington Irving there, the guy who brought us The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. Big name in American literature at that time. He was already famous before Poe even began his career.
And this has got to be one of my favorite parts of the book that you won't find in any of the later editions you see today. Poe devotes an entire appendix of his own book to trash-talking the work of one of his rival authors and to insulting the people who actually like that guy's works. Now, who says that Poe doesn't have a sense of humor?
So how'd the book do? Not well. I told you he had a lot of trouble getting it published. And the publisher said, okay, we'll print your book, but we can't pay you for it. No royalties. We'll give you 20 free copies of the book. And, you can give them out to friends, or maybe sell them on the side if you like. So no royalties for it. The run was printed of only 750 copies, of which this is one of those copies. But don't give up. It wasn't an auspicious beginning, but just 6 years later, in 1845, The Raven came out, made Poe a household name. Everybody knew Edgar the Raven Poe, and he was able to get another book of short stories published. The difference is, this time he got royalties. And he's able to actually earn quite a bit of money, and they reissued the book 4 years later. So it seemed to sell pretty well. The main difference is, for this new collection of short stories, he didn't get to pick out which stories were in it. He had an editor do that, and they mostly picked out Poe's detective stories. His comedies didn't all make the cut. Maybe that's why it sold so much better. But why don't you take a read at King Pest or The Loss of Breath? Let us know what you think down in the comments. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces like these Poe first editions, why not become a patron at patreon.com/Poe Museum. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing cat stuff.